The key wouldn't turn. I stood there on my own front porch, staring at the brass lock that had opened the same way for 30 years, and felt my stomach drop. This was my grandfather's cabin, passed down to me when he died 2 years ago, and I knew every inch of it by heart. The lock had always been a little finicky, requiring just the right angle and a gentle push, but this was different. This key didn't even fit. I tried again, thinking maybe I had grabbed the wrong key from my ring, but no. This was definitely the right key, worn smooth from decades of use, with the tiny scratch near the head that I remembered from childhood visits. Something was very wrong here. I walked around the cabin, checking the windows, looking for any sign of damage or break-in, but everything appeared normal from the outside. The familiar cedar siding looked the same, the wraparound porch was clean, and even the old rocking chair sat in its usual spot. That's when I noticed the other changes. The gravel driveway had been freshly raked and smoothed, something I definitely hadn't done before leaving 3 months ago. The trash bins, usually tucked behind the cabin near the tree line, had been moved to the front corner of the property. Most strange of all, there was a small wooden sign staked into the ground near the fence that read, "Guest parking only," in neat block letters. I had never seen that sign before in my life. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I had been away dealing with my mother's estate after her unexpected passing, spending weeks sorting through paperwork and settling her affairs in the city. The cabin had been the furthest thing from my mind during those difficult months, but it should have been sitting here exactly as I left it, waiting for my return. This was my sanctuary, my escape from the world, nestled 3 miles up a winding mountain road where cell service barely reached, and the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I pulled out my phone and managed to get a weak signal after walking to the edge of the clearing. A quick search brought up the number for a local locksmith, and I explained my situation as calmly as I could manage. The dispatcher assured me that someone would be out within the hour, and I spent the time pacing around my property, trying to piece together what might have happened. Maybe the previous owner had given a spare key to someone for emergencies, and they had changed the locks for security reasons. Maybe there had been some kind of maintenance issue that required access. But deep down, I knew something more complicated was going on. This cabin sat just outside the boundaries of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, a fact that had always been a source of tension with some of the more controlling board members. My grandfather had been careful to purchase the property before the HOA was established, ensuring that his family retreat would never be subject to their rules and regulations. Over the years, several board members had made comments about the underutilized property, suggesting that it would be better served as part of the community rather than sitting empty for months at a time. The locksmith arrived right on schedule, a friendly older man named Pete who had been serving the mountain communities for over 20 years. He took one look at the lock and shook his head with a knowing expression. "This has been recently changed," he told me, pointing to fresh scratches around the bolt housing. "See these marks here? This is professional work, done within the last few weeks, I'd say. You sure you didn't have someone do this for you?" I assured him that I had not authorized any lock changes, and he got to work. Within 15 minutes, he had the new lock removed and was installing a temporary replacement that would work with my original key. As he worked, he mentioned that he had been getting more calls lately about locks being changed without permission, mostly in vacation rental areas where property management companies were trying to maintain control over units. The comment sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to push the thought away. Pete finished his work and handed me back my key, along with a bill for the service call. I thanked him and watched as his truck disappeared down the mountain road, leaving me alone with my increasingly uncomfortable suspicions. I took a deep breath and inserted my key into the new lock, turning it slowly until I heard the familiar click of the bolt sliding back. The door swung open, and I stepped inside my cabin for the first time in 3 months. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The space that I had left rustic and lived in had been completely transformed into something that looked like a vacation rental showcase. Fresh white towels were folded neatly on every surface, replaced with coordinating sets that I had never seen before. A wicker welcome basket sat on the dining table, filled with local honey, trail mix, and a bottle of wine, complete with a ribbon and a card that read, "Welcome to Pine Ridge Retreat," in flowing script. But the most shocking discovery was the thick binder sitting prominently on the coffee table, its cover emblazoned with the same Pine Ridge Retreat logo. I opened it with trembling hands and found page after page of professionally printed house rules, local attraction guides, and even laminated emergency contact information. There was a check-in and check-out procedure, a list of amenities, and detailed instructions for everything from operating the fireplace to using the hiking trails that crossed my property. That's when I heard voices coming from the back bedroom, followed by the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floors. A middle-aged couple appeared in the hallway, both wearing hiking clothes and looking completely bewildered by my presence. The woman clutched a coffee mug with the Pine Ridge Retreat logo, while the man held what appeared to be a trail map of the area. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice polite but confused, "but I think there might be some mistake. We checked into this rental yesterday through Mountain Getaway Properties. We have a confirmation email and everything." She pulled out her phone and showed me a booking confirmation that included photos of my cabin, complete with the same professional staging that now surrounded us. I stared at the email, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The listing described Pine Ridge Retreat as a charming mountain cabin perfect for couples seeking a romantic getaway, complete with hiking trails, complete privacy, and authentic rustic charm with modern amenities. The photos were definitely of my cabin, but they had been taken recently, after someone had staged it with rental furniture and decor that I had never purchased. What made it even more disturbing was how professional the whole operation looked. The photos had been taken by someone who clearly knew what they were doing, with perfect lighting and angles that made my rustic cabin look like a luxury retreat. There were shots of the bedroom that I barely recognized, decorated with expensive-looking bedding and accent pillows that coordinated perfectly with the color scheme. The kitchen had been photographed with artfully arranged fruit bowls and high-end appliances that I was certain hadn't been there when I left. The listing even included amenities that didn't exist on my property. It promised complimentary firewood delivery, daily housekeeping service, and concierge assistance for local activities. There was mention of a private hot tub on the deck, which was completely fabricated, since my cabin had never had a hot tub. The description painted a picture of a full-service luxury experience that was completely at odds with the simple mountain retreat that my grandfather had built decades ago. I scrolled through more of the booking details and found reviews from previous guests, all glowing testimonials about their wonderful stays at Pine Ridge Retreat. One reviewer raved about the impeccable cleanliness and attention to detail, while another praised the thoughtful welcome amenities and local recommendations. These weren't fake reviews either. They were clearly written by real people who had actually stayed in my cabin without my knowledge. The most unsettling part was reading about how these strangers had used my personal space. One review mentioned relaxing in the comfortable reading nook by the fireplace, which was the corner where my grandfather's old leather chair sat. The same chair where I had spent countless evenings reading as a child. Another guest had taken photos of themselves cooking in my kitchen, using my grandmother's cast-iron skillet that had been in the family for generations. I felt violated in a way that went beyond simple property theft. These people had been living in my family's sanctuary, sleeping in the bed where I had processed my grief after my mother's death, using the kitchen where I had shared meals with my grandfather during his final years. They had no idea they were trespassing, but that didn't make the invasion feel any less personal. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, "but this is my property. I own this cabin, and I definitely did not authorize it to be rented to anyone." The couple exchanged worried glances, and I felt terrible for them. They had clearly booked what they believed to be a legitimate vacation rental, paying good money for a romantic getaway that had turned into a nightmare. The man showed me his phone, scrolling through the booking details and payment confirmation. "We paid $450 for 3 nights, he explained, and we were told that all the amenities were included. The property management company even sent us a welcome email with the door code and instructions for check-in." He paused, looking around the cabin with new understanding. "You're saying this is all fake?" Before I could answer, we all heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway outside. Through the front window, I watched as a familiar silver sedan came to a stop near the guest parking sign. My heart began to race as I recognized the vehicle, and my suspicions were confirmed when the driver's door opened and Margaret Chen stepped out. Her perfectly styled hair and pressed blazer unmistakable even from a distance. Margaret was the president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, a position she had held for the past 4 years with an iron grip and an increasingly authoritarian approach to community management. She was known throughout the neighborhood for her passive-aggressive enforcement of rules that seemed to change according to her personal preferences, and she had made no secret of her disapproval of properties that didn't contribute to what she called community enhancement. What I hadn't realized until this moment was how far her obsession with control had evolved. Margaret had always been the type of person who needed to manage every aspect of her environment, from the exact shade of paint that homeowners could use on their shutters to the specific types of plants allowed in front yards. She had turned the HOA meetings into micromanagement sessions, where she would spend hours debating the merits of different mailbox designs or the proper height for garden fences. But this went far beyond typical HOA overreach. This was criminal behavior disguised as community leadership. I realize now that all of her previous complaints about underutilized properties hadn't been idle criticism. They had been reconnaissance missions, identifying targets for her illegal rental scheme. She had probably been watching my cabin for months, tracking my visits, and noting when the property sat empty for extended periods. I remembered how she had always asked pointed questions about my travel schedule during community events, disguising her interest as neighborly concern. She would comment on how peaceful the mountain road must be during the winter months when so few people were around, or how convenient it must be to have such privacy when I needed to get away from the city. At the time, I had attributed her questions to polite small talk, but now I understood that she had been gathering intelligence for her criminal enterprise. The more I thought about it, the more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Margaret had access to property records through her HOA position, which would have given her detailed information about ownership, tax assessments, and legal boundaries. She knew exactly which properties fell outside HOA jurisdiction, which ones had absentee owners, and which ones would be most attractive to vacation rental guests. My cabin checked all the boxes: remote location, attractive mountain setting, and an owner who lived hours away and visited infrequently. I remembered our last conversation, which had taken place at the community center during a heated HOA meeting about 6 months ago. She had made several pointed comments about underutilized properties and suggested that owners who didn't maintain a regular presence in the community should consider more productive uses for their land. At the time, I had dismissed her comments as typical HOA posturing, but now they took on a much more sinister meaning. Margaret walked up to the front door with the confident stride of someone who expected to be in control of the situation. But her expression changed the moment she saw me through the window. Her face went pale, and she hesitated on the porch steps, clearly not expecting to encounter the actual property owner. She had probably assumed that I would be away for several more weeks, giving her time to manage whatever scheme she had constructed around my cabin. I opened the door before she could knock, and we stared at each other for a long moment. Behind me, the confused couple stood in the living room, still holding their booking confirmations and looking like they wanted to disappear. Margaret's eyes darted between me and the visitors, and I could practically see her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to explain the situation. "David," she said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "what a surprise to see you back so early. I thought you were dealing with family matters in the city." Her voice had that artificially cheerful tone that she used during HOA meetings when she was trying to control a situation that was spiraling out of her grasp. I replied, keeping my voice level and calm. "But I finished sooner than expected and decided to come back to my cabin." Imagine my surprise when I discovered that someone had changed my locks and turned my property into a vacation rental without my knowledge or permission. I gestured toward the couple behind me, who were now looking extremely uncomfortable. Margaret's smile flickered, and she glanced nervously at the rental guests. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here," she said, her voice taking on a slightly higher pitch. "The HOA has been working with several property management companies to help community members maximize the value of their investments. Perhaps there was some confusion about your participation in the program." The audacity of her response was breathtaking. She was standing on my porch, looking at clear evidence of unauthorized entry and rental fraud, and trying to frame it as some kind of community service initiative. I felt my anger building, but I forced myself to remain calm. This situation required careful handling, and I needed to gather as much evidence as possible before taking any action. "Margaret," I said, stepping aside so she could see the staged interior of my cabin, "I never signed up for any property management program, and I certainly never gave anyone permission to change my locks or rent my property to strangers. What I'm looking at here appears to be theft and fraud, and I need you to explain exactly how my cabin ended up listed as Pine Ridge Retreat by Mountain Getaway Properties." She stepped inside, her eyes taking in the professional staging and rental materials, and I could see her calculating how much she had invested in transforming my property. The welcome basket alone must have cost $50, and the custom binder and signage represented significant time and expense. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a carefully planned operation that had been in development for weeks or months. The HOA board discussed several options for managing vacant properties in the community, she said, her voice becoming more defensive, and we identified several units that could benefit from professional property management services. Your cabin has been sitting empty for months, and we felt that it would be better utilized as a rental property that could contribute to the local economy. I stared at her in disbelief. "Margaret, my property isn't even within HOA jurisdiction. You have no authority over my cabin, and you certainly have no right to break into it and turn it into a business without my consent." I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of the staging, the rental materials, and Margaret's presence in my illegally accessed property. The couple who had been caught in the middle of this situation finally spoke up. "We're going to pack our things and leave," the woman said quietly. "We obviously don't want to be involved in whatever this is, and we'll be contacting our credit card company to dispute the charges." They disappeared into the bedroom, and I could hear them hurriedly stuffing their belongings into suitcases. Margaret watched them go, and I could see panic beginning to replace her earlier confidence. "David, I think we can work this out without involving any outside parties," she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "The HOA was just trying to help maintain property values in the area, and we can certainly come to some arrangement that benefits everyone involved." But I was already dialing 911 on my phone, and Margaret's eyes widened as she realized that I wasn't going to be talked out of reporting the crime. "I'd like to report a breaking and entering and rental fraud," I told the dispatcher, giving my address and a brief description of the situation. "The perpetrator is still on the property, and I have evidence of the illegal activity." The dispatcher told me that officers would be dispatched immediately, and I ended the call to find Margaret staring at me with a mixture of anger and fear. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "The HOA board will hear about this, and there will be consequences for your refusal to participate in community improvement initiatives." I almost laughed at the absurdity of her threat. She had broken into my property, changed my locks, and rented it out to strangers, and she was trying to make me feel like the unreasonable one for reporting her crimes. "Margaret, you need to sit down and wait for the police to arrive," I told her firmly. "And I would suggest that you start thinking about how you're going to explain this situation to the officers, because what you've done here is illegal, and there's going to be consequences." The rental guests emerged from the bedroom with their packed bags, looking embarrassed and frustrated. They apologized profusely for the situation, even though they were clearly victims of Margaret's scheme, and I assured them that I understood they had been deceived. They hurried out to their car and drove away, probably planning to leave negative reviews for Mountain Getaway Properties and demand refunds for their ruined vacation. Margaret and I waited in uncomfortable silence for the police to arrive, and I used the time to document everything I could find. The rental binder contained detailed financial records showing that my cabin had been booked for 12 different stays over the past 2 months, generating over $6,000 in rental income. There were check-in instructions, cleaning schedules, and even a maintenance log showing that Margaret had hired contractors to make improvements to my property without my knowledge. I also discovered a folder hidden in the kitchen drawer that contained documents related to the fake business license she had created for the rental operation. Mountain Getaway Properties was registered to her home address, and the paperwork showed that she had been operating the illegal rental business for at least 6 months, probably targeting other vacant properties in the area while their owners were away. The level of sophistication in Margaret's operation was truly staggering. She had created a complete corporate identity for mountain getaway properties, complete with professional letterhead, business cards, and even a website that looked entirely legitimate. The site featured testimonials from satisfied customers, detailed property descriptions, and professional photography that must have cost thousands of dollars to produce. She had invested serious money into making her illegal business look credible. But what shocked me most was discovering the detailed spreadsheet that tracked her rental income from multiple properties. My cabin was listed as Property A and showed consistent bookings at rates between $150 and $200 per night, depending on the season. There were 3 other properties listed as Property B, Property C, and Property D, all generating similar rental income, and all located in remote areas where owners might not discover the unauthorized activity for months. The financial records showed that Margaret had been grossing over $15,000 per month from her illegal rental empire, money that she had been funneling through a series of bank accounts registered under different variations of her business name. She had been meticulous about covering her tracks, using separate checking accounts for each property and routing the payments through online booking platforms that made the transactions look legitimate to casual observers. I found receipts for all the furniture and staging materials she had purchased to transform the properties into attractive vacation rentals. She had bought matching bedding sets, coordinated towels, welcome baskets, and even custom signage for each property. The investment in my cabin alone exceeded $3,000, money that she had clearly expected to recoup through months of unauthorized rental income. There were also detailed maintenance logs, showing that Margaret had hired contractors to make improvements to the properties without the owner's knowledge. She had arranged for carpet cleaning, window washing, and even minor repairs, like fixing leaky faucets and replacing burnt-out light bulbs. In a twisted way, she had been maintaining the properties better than some of the actual owners, but only because she needed them to generate positive reviews from rental guests. The most disturbing discovery was a handwritten notebook that contained what appeared to be surveillance notes about the property owners. Margaret had been tracking our schedules, noting when we visited our cabins and how long we typically stayed away. She had recorded details about our personal lives, including information about family emergencies, work travel, and seasonal patterns that might affect our presence at the properties. For my cabin specifically, she had noted that I typically visited during holiday weekends and summer months, but that I had been absent since early spring due to what she described as family issues in the city. She had even researched my mother's obituary online and calculated that the estate settlement process would likely keep me away for several more months, giving her a clear window to maximize her rental income from my property. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at the cabin, and I met them on the porch to explain the situation. Deputy Rodriguez, a serious-looking woman in her 30s, took detailed notes as I described discovering the changed locks, the rental staging, and Margaret's presence on my property. Her partner, Deputy Williams, photographed the evidence and interviewed Margaret separately. Margaret tried to maintain her story about HOA community improvement initiatives, but the deputies weren't buying it. They had dealt with similar cases of rental fraud in the past, and they recognized the signs of an organized scam. The fake business license, the professional staging, and the detailed booking records all pointed to a deliberate criminal enterprise rather than a community service project gone wrong. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, theft and fraud," Deputy Rodriguez told Margaret, pulling out her handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Margaret's face crumpled as the reality of her situation finally sank in, and she began to cry as the deputy read her the rest of her rights. As they loaded Margaret into the patrol car, Deputy Williams handed me a case number and explained the next steps in the legal process. I would need to file a formal complaint with the district attorney's office, document all the financial damages to my property, and provide testimony for the criminal case. He also recommended that I contact a civil attorney to pursue damages for the unauthorized use of my property and the profits that Margaret had generated from her illegal rental business. Margaret sat in the back of the patrol car with tears streaming down her face, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. Through the window, I could see her frantically making phone calls, probably trying to reach her lawyer or family members who could help post bail. The confident, controlling woman who had terrorized the HOA meetings for years had been reduced to a crying, desperate criminal who had gambled everything on a scheme that had finally collapsed. Deputy Rodriguez approached me with additional paperwork and explained that Margaret would be held pending arraignment, but that she would likely be released on bail within 24 hours. "You need to be prepared for her to try to contact you," she warned me. "People in her situation often try to negotiate or make deals to avoid prosecution. But I strongly advise you not to engage with her without your attorney present." The deputy also explained that the investigation would likely uncover additional victims, since Margaret's rental operation appeared to be much larger than just my cabin. "We'll be coordinating with other law enforcement agencies to identify the other properties she was renting illegally," she said. "Your cooperation in this case could help us build a stronger case against her and recover damages for other victims who might not even know they've been victimized yet." As the patrol cars disappeared down the mountain road, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but I knew that the legal battle was just beginning. I would need to document every aspect of the damage to my property, calculate the fair market value of the unauthorized rental income, and prepare for months of court proceedings and depositions. I also realized that I would need to completely restore my cabin to its original condition, removing all traces of Margaret's rental staging and returning it to the family sanctuary that my grandfather had intended it to be. The violation felt so complete that I wondered if I would ever be able to enjoy the property the same way again, knowing that strangers had been living in my personal space and using my family's belongings without permission. But as I walked through the cabin one more time, taking inventory of everything that needed to be addressed, I felt a growing sense of determination. Margaret had tried to steal more than just rental income. She had tried to steal my family's legacy and turn it into a commodity for her personal profit. The fact that she had been caught and would face consequences for her crimes felt like a victory not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been bullied or manipulated by someone in a position of authority. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the property that had been at the center of so much drama and criminal activity. In a few hours, the cabin would be quiet and peaceful again, but it would take much longer for the legal system to sort out all the damage that Margaret had caused with her elaborate scheme. I watched the patrol car disappear down the mountain road, leaving me alone in my cabin for the first time in months. The rental staging was still in place, a bizarre reminder of the violation that had taken place in my absence, but I felt a sense of relief that justice was finally being served. Margaret had gambled that I would never discover her scheme, and she had lost that bet in the most dramatic way possible. Over the next few weeks, the full scope of Margaret's operation became clear as the investigation continued. She had been targeting vacant properties throughout the mountain communities, focusing on cabins and second homes whose owners lived out of state or visited infrequently. My cabin was just one of 4 properties that she had illegally converted into vacation rentals, generating tens of thousands of dollars in profits that she had funneled through her fake property management company. The other victims came forward, one by one, as news of Margaret's arrest spread through the community. The owners of Property B were a retired couple from Phoenix who had inherited a cabin from relatives and visited only once per year. They had no idea that their property had been generating rental income for Margaret, complete with professional photography and glowing reviews from guests who praised the cozy mountain atmosphere and thoughtful hospitality touches. Property C belonged to a military family stationed overseas, who had been planning to use their cabin as a retirement home but hadn't visited in over 18 months due to deployment schedules. Margaret had been renting their property as a rustic military heritage retreat, complete with fabricated stories about the property's history and patriotic decorations that she had installed without permission. The 4th property was perhaps the most heartbreaking case. It belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had built the cabin as an anniversary gift in the 1970s. After his death, she had been unable to visit due to mobility issues, but she had kept the property in hopes that her grandchildren might want to use it someday. Margaret had been renting it as a vintage romantic getaway, using Mrs. Patterson's personal photographs and mementos as decorative elements to create an authentic, lived-in atmosphere. The investigation revealed that Margaret had been grossing over $25,000 per month from her illegal rental empire, money that she had been using to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle. She had purchased a new luxury car, taken expensive vacations, and even renovated her own home using profits from her victims' properties. The Financial Crimes Unit discovered that she had been operating the scheme for over 18 months, generating a total of nearly $500,000 in illegal rental income. The scandal rocked the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, and Margaret's arrest made headlines in the local newspaper. Several board members resigned in embarrassment, and the entire organization was restructured under new leadership that promised transparency and accountability. The new board issued a formal apology to all community members and implemented strict oversight procedures to prevent future abuse of authority. But the biggest revelation came when investigators discovered that Margaret's rental fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. She had been embezzling money from HOA dues for over 2 years, using her position as board president to authorize fake maintenance contracts and community improvement projects that existed only on paper. The missing funds totaled over $40,000, money that should have been used for legitimate community services and infrastructure improvements. The HOA embezzlement scheme was almost as sophisticated as her rental fraud operation. Margaret had created fake invoices for snow removal, landscaping, and road maintenance services that were never actually performed. She had established relationships with fictional contractors and service providers, complete with fake business licenses and references that would pass casual inspection. The money had been flowing into her personal accounts for years, hidden among legitimate HOA expenses and approved by a board that trusted her completely. What made the embezzlement even more egregious was that Margaret had been raising HOA dues annually to cover the fictional expenses she was creating. Homeowners had been paying hundreds of dollars extra each year to fund services that existed only in Margaret's fraudulent accounting books. The community had been unknowingly subsidizing her criminal lifestyle while she lived in luxury and expanded her illegal rental operation using their money. Margaret eventually pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, along with restitution payments to all of her victims. The civil lawsuit that I filed against her resulted in a substantial judgment that covered not only my financial damages but also punitive damages for the violation of my property rights. The fake mountain getaway properties business was shut down permanently, and Margaret was banned from operating any kind of property management or rental business in the future. As I stood on my porch that final day, watching the last of the rental staging being removed from my cabin, I realized that Margaret's biggest mistake wasn't just stealing from her neighbors or running an illegal business. Her biggest mistake was assuming that she could get away with it indefinitely, that her victims would never discover her crimes or fight back against her abuse of power. She had built her entire scheme on the assumption that she was smarter and more careful than everyone else, but in the end, all it took was one unexpected homecoming to bring her empire of fraud crashing down around her. The real owner had walked in, and her carefully constructed lies had crumbled in an instant.